Everyone, it's 10 o'clock. I'll start this hearing. Can I check everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone's busy at the back there. So this is a local hearing being held under Schedule 2, Part 8 of the Flood Risk Management of Scotland Act 2009. It is being held to consider outstanding objections to the proposed Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme, which is being promoted under the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act 2009 and the Flood Risk Management Flood Protection Scheme's Potentially Vulnerable Areas and Local Plan Districts Scotland Regulations 2010 as amended. My name is Sue Bell. I'm an independent reporter who's been nominated by the Department of Planning and Environmental Appeals, also known as DPA, to conduct this hearing on behalf of Falkirk Council. Before I ask you all to introduce yourselves, there are a few housekeeping items to mention. I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded and stored as part of the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme archive and will be capable of repeated viewing. By participating in this meeting, you're consenting to being filmed and to the use and storage of these images and sound recordings and any information pertaining to you contained in them for webcasting purposes and for purposes of keeping historical records and making those records available to the public. To assist with that, you'll see that there are microphones in front of you, and I would ask that when you speak, if you could press the button so the red light comes on, and remember to turn it off at the end of when you've spoken. And you can move microphones around if there's a need to do that. There are no scheduled fire alarms taking place today. The fire alarm is a siren and an audible message advising occupants of the stadium that there is an emergency situation. If we hear this, we should all leave out of the nearest safest exit, which from this room you can leave the way that you entered. There are two different fire doors at either end of the room. Then we follow the directional arrows on the green running man signs, and the meeting point will be the central walkway, which is located between the two monoblocked car parks at the front of the main stadium. There are toilets just in the corridor outside here, and there's an accessible toilet outside opposite the There's a cafe which is open between 9 to 3 on this floor, and guests are welcome to purchase food or beverages from there and bring them into the lounge if they wish. And the stadium doesn't allow people to bring in their own catering, to mention that. And then finally, I'm sure you've already done it, but if you could put your phones onto silent or do not disturb, that would be much appreciated. So I'm now going to ask everybody to introduce themselves. And anybody that they've got with them as witnesses or support. I'm conscious we're a bit tight on space, and so people might be swapping people in and out of table, but if you could introduce them all at the beginning, that would be most helpful. Thank you. I'm going to start by asking Falkirk Council as promoters of the scheme to introduce their team. So if I could turn to you first, please.
Good morning, everybody. Alistair Dawson, Falkirk Council. I'm the manager of the infrastructure projects team. We've been leading on this project. Also my colleague Sharon Agnew's with us. She's sitting in the front row of the guests. And just to introduce the rest of the team, Alan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, Alan McGowan from Jacobs, the design and consent manager for the scheme.
Thanks, Mark.
Good morning, ma'am. Mark McMurray, I'm a partner at CMS, legal representation for this morning. To my left, I have Katie Nolan, who's a colleague of mine, and the only other person to introduce is Rosanna Mooney, who's Associate Director of Ecology at Jacobs, and is sitting behind us here.
Thank you. Now I'm going to just work my way along the table from those people who've objected to the scheme and are participating this morning. I'm starting, I can see first we've got Paul Fort, so would you like to introduce your team, please?
Hi everyone, Focus Works. This one's now, hi everyone, I'm Derek Knox, I'm the Regional Director for Scotland for both ports. I'm joined with Barry Heaps, who is Head of Engineering in Scotland, and Ian Kerr, who is Infrastructure Manager in Scotland, alongside the legal representatives who all pass over to Robbie.
Thank you. Good morning, ma'am. My name is Robbie Owen. I'm a partner at Pinston Masons here representing Port Ports Limited, along with my colleague Roisin Giles.
Yeah, good morning. Roisin Giles, Associate at Pinston Masons.
And Emma McCaslin, I'm head of
legal at Temple Street.
Thank you. Thank you. Then if I could go into the corner, your name badge is flipped round, but if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Good morning, Brian Gall, Director of Jarvie Plant.
Thank you. Thanks, you're right.
Hi, I'm Esme Cloud. I'm head of planning at RSPB Scotland.
Morning, everyone. I'm Toby Wilson. I'm a senior coordination officer with RSPB Scotland.
Thank you, everyone. I'd also like to note and acknowledge that there are a number of other outstanding people who objected to the scheme who are not here today. Everyone who made an objection that was outstanding has been invited to participate, but obviously not everybody has chosen to do so, although some have submitted hearing statements. That in no way prejudices the consideration of those objections, as I've seen all the written objections that have been submitted to the council, and I will be using those when I draft my report and advice to the council. So just a little bit about what today is all about, and to set out the purpose of the meeting, and then I'll go on to explain how the meeting is going to proceed. So as you all know, Falkirk Council, as the relevant local authority, has proposed and consulted upon the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme. It has made a preliminary decision to confirm the scheme without modification. As there are outstanding valid objections to the scheme, Schedule 2, Part 8 of the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act requires the local authority to hold a hearing to consider the proposed scheme. As I said, I've been appointed as the independent reporter to conduct this hearing, and I'll be preparing a report for Falkirk Council with my recommendations. The decision whether to confirm the proposed scheme without modifications, or to confirm the proposed scheme with modifications, or to reject the proposed scheme will be taken by Falkirk Council. And the purpose of this hearing is for me to gather all the information necessary for my report, and it will also enable parties who wish to present their respective points of view. So how it's going to work this morning is it's going to be a structured discussion, which will be led by me. I've read the documents that you've all submitted. Thank you for the additional hearing statements. I've read your initial objections and the council's responses to these. I've also reviewed the scheme design documents, and I will consider all of those in drafting the report. Last week, in very inclement weather, I made an unaccompanied site visit to the various locations that I anticipate we'll be discussing today. And as you know, I will be undertaking an accompanied site inspection of land, which is in morning for presentations of cases, and there won't be any formal cross-examination unless I specifically agree to it. There's no need for you to repeat verbatim from your written statements, but if you do wish to refer to those, I would ask you to identify which document it is, paragraph, page number, and allow us all a little time to find the correct document, either digitally or in a paper form, so that we can be really sure that we know which item you're wanting to draw our attention to. On that point, you'll see me scribbling furiously throughout the morning. I may ask you to pause, or I may ask you to repeat things. Don't be off put by that, it's just to make sure that I can get down the points you wish to make to me in an accurate and legible form. And obviously the hearing being recorded will assist with that process. Although I will invite specific people to contribute to the discussion at certain times, I will welcome comments and questions from any of you as the discussion progresses. And I will certainly be putting a number of questions to the proper discussion. In terms of timing, I'm anticipating that we'll run to around about 4:30 today. We'll see how we progress through the agenda. As you know, we do have a second day allocated should we need it. I don't want to unnecessarily constrain discussions, but when I feel I've got the information that I need, I will be wishing to move us on. If we think that, you know, maybe an extra half an hour tonight would help us complete the discussions in one day, we'll do that, but I'll take people's opinion as we progress throughout the day. We'll take a break of about an hour, around about lunchtime, somewhere around about 12:30 to 1. And we'll also take some short breaks mid-morning and mid-afternoon. But this isn't an endurance exercise. If at any point people feel that they need a short break, either for comfort or because they need to consult with other members of their team, just please indicate that to me, and I'm sure we can accommodate that. Before we move into the sort of discussion of the items on the agenda, has anyone got any questions about the procedure this morning?
No, I'm not sure. there were a couple of one particular procedural matter in relation to correspondence submitted by RSPB that I thought maybe worth dealing with at the outset before we get into the.
We could deal with that now. We could deal with it when we come to that point, which is where I anticipated we might deal with it.
Back in your hands, man.
Yeah, that okay, we'll deal with it at that point. Hopefully it shouldn't influence any of the discussions up to that point. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, chip in. Thank you. Okay, then, if we can move to item 2 of the agenda, which is related to the scheme design. And I thought it would just be a little helpful context, really, to start with a brief consideration and understanding of why the scheme is necessary and the approach that has been taken to designing it. I appreciate that the scheme has been designed over an extended period and that the iterations and approach has been set out in numerous supporting documents. So I'm grateful to the council for providing a summary of the approach taken in the hearing statement that it provided dated the 16th of December 2025. I anticipate we might be referring to this during our discussion, so I'll just allow everyone to grab a copy of that if they need to. So if I could start perhaps by asking the council to set up briefly, and obviously not in detail from all things, but the reasons that the scheme is considered necessary.
Hand over to Mr. Dawson, who can probably give you detail on the background on the justification and the need for the scheme.
Thank you. So yes, as set out in our written statements, the justification for the scheme goes back to many years to the SEBA Flood Risk Management Act and the local strategies. Work has been proceeding on the scheme for many years, and obviously we've reached this point where we've modified the scheme in 2024. I'm not really sure there's much more to add. I think it's fairly clearly set out within our written statement, and I believe that the parties that are undertaking and participating today will have had the opportunity to review that.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to sort of pick up on various points that were raised in representations as we go through. So some of the objectives have questioned what the flood risk is in certain areas and have suggested obviously that certain parts of the river haven't flooded, and that's been raised, I think, particularly in relation to parts of the River Carron, including at Stirling Road and along the Chapelburn, and also parts of Grangemouth and Zetland Park. So I wonder if we'd just like to provide a bit of detail about how that element has been assessed.
I'll just pass that to Alan from the technical perspective.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I suppose kind of first point I'd like to make on that is that simply because a area or a property hasn't experienced flooding doesn't mean that it's not at flood risk. Often, in fact, the whole approach in Scotland kind of changed with the publication of the 2009 Act, that prior to that Act, flood protection schemes were very much taken forward on a reactive basis following incidents of flooding in towns and in cities. But the 2009 Act introduced a kind of plan-led approach, which resulted in SEPA undertaking as the kind of strategic flood risk authority in Scotland, undertaking the kind of national flood risk assessment to identify across Scotland, where properties were at risk of flooding, and that ultimately, I suppose, resulted in 2015 in the publication of the flood risk management strategies for the 14 local plan districts within Scotland. Which then, I suppose, led to further work being done in this particular case also by Falkirk Council to address the actions that came out of the flood risk management, the flood risk management strategy. And one of those actions was to develop a greater understanding of flood risk within the areas that were identified. And that has, as is common with these types of projects, resulted in hydrological analysis and hydraulic modelling of water courses to understand the risk for, you know, a range of different probabilities. We'll probably come on to that this scheme is looking to address what's referred to as either the 1 in 200 year event or the event of a 0.5% chance of happening in each year. But there's been detailed modelling carried out. That modelling has been reviewed by SEPA on several occasions, and SEPA, I think when they initially updated their flood maps, I think again round about 2015-16, used the information from the modelling that the council had done, as it was recognised that that was the kind of best source of information on flood risk for the Grangemouth area. So that information, which has been made available on the kind of scheme's website, illustrates the risk in different areas across the scheme area for different probabilities of events. So I would say a kind of key point in that is that, you know, I think that is accepted within the kind of the flood risk community, and SEPA as the you know, I suppose perceived, I shouldn't say perceived experts. You know, they have a strategic role in flood management and accept the findings of those studies that, you know, there is a significant risk in Grangemouth, and just because we haven't seen recent flood events doesn't mean that there isn't a risk that needs to be addressed. And I say the whole kind of plan-led approach that we undertake in Scotland that hopefully will mean that these risks are actually addressed before they actually materialise and people's properties are affected.
And I was going to ask you, just to clarify, you've already mentioned anyway, the 1 in 200 or 5.5%. Obviously, there are some comments in the representations, and perhaps you'd just like to clarify what a 1 in 200 year flood event means.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that because it's often something that is misunderstood. And certainly in some of the objections that were mentioned, that were submitted, mention that flooding won't happen for 200 years, or it's over a 200-year period that we're looking. And that's not the case. That, you know, the 1 in 200 is a probability. I appreciate it's difficult. It's a difficult concept for the public quite often to understand, and often it is presented alternatively as the 0.5% chance of happening in a year. To be honest, I'm not sure that makes it much easier to clarify. But in this particular case, the 1 in 200 year that's been adopted for the scheme was identified in the flood risk management strategy published by SEPA and the Scottish Government as the kind of standard of protection we should be aiming for. And I would say, in my experience, being involved in numerous schemes in Scotland, you know, that is the kind of, it's not written in legislation, but tends to be the standard that most local authorities look to achieve. But, you know, there is examples of lower standards of protection being adopted. Equally, there's examples across Scotland of higher standards of protection. But it's really, you know, ultimately it's for council to choose what's the appropriate standard of protection. But yeah, in this case, we align with the published strategies.
Thank you. Just following that on, my recollection from the reading is that you've also allowed a contingency element, if I can put it that way, for climate change and freeboard. I don't know whether you can just explain a little bit more about what extra that adds on, as it were.
Yes, so yeah, again, and it's not unique to this particular project, but within the hydraulic modelling that's carried out, there is uncertainty, and you know, the term sometimes used as freeboard allowance, sometimes it's the residual uncertainty allowance, but it's to reflect that all the kind of information that goes into that analysis, whether it's hydrological data or even the topographic data that's used to construct these models, that there is elements of uncertainty. and the modelling itself simplifies, you know, the kind of the physics that actually apply in the real world. So it's generally accepted that we have to include an allowance for that uncertainty in terms of the height of flood defences. And the vast majority of the Grangemouth scheme, that allowance is 600 millimetres, which again, it kind of goes back to some early guidance that was published by the Environment Agency. There's no specific Scottish guidance, and quite often in Scotland we use guidance published elsewhere, or certainly at least refer to guidance. So the 600 millimetres comes from a historic EA guidance document on fluvial freeboard. But in some locations within Grangemouth, we have varied that freeboard. In one particular case, which is along Bowman Avenue, which is, if we included the freeboard, we would have had to, or the 600 millimetres freeboard, we would have had to have constructed an additional about 1 to 1.5 kilometres of flood defence. A decision within the project team, after kind of careful analysis, was taken to reduce the freeboard there, which means that we don't have to build any flood defences, because the existing kind of ground levels and property levels are all higher than the predicted flood level. But it is recognised as an area that if we were to get, you know, a forecast event that we thought could reach that level, that is maybe something that the council would have to take action on, because there is the potential that we could get inundation there. But yeah, it's fairly common to include for those uncertainties, rather than just taking the absolute predicted water level, which again, kind of going back to the modelling, assumes a flat water surface. And if we all see images of flooding in the press, you know, water during a flood event isn't a still lake, it has waves, so the freeboard accounts for that. In terms of climate change, we, again, an early decision on the scheme was taken to incorporate a relatively modest amount for climate change. And that was in recognition of the kind of long duration that's anticipated that this scheme would travel from the kind of initial studies through to construction. And there was a concern that if we adopted the kind of hydrology that was from about 2020, if we adopted that and the scheme took 10-15 years to build, that by 2030 we would have 15 years of 10 to 15 years of climate change, and therefore wouldn't have the kind of standard of protection that we were setting out for. So we allowed for climate change up until the 2030s. So the standard of protection for the scheme is the 1 in 200 year event in 2030. But beyond that, you know, it's recognised that there may need to be further action in the future, depending what actually happens in terms of predicted sea level rises or increases in rainfall. But yeah, this particular scheme doesn't include for climate change for, say, over the next 100 years or so, which some other schemes have included those allowances.
Okay, thank you. And can I just also clarify, obviously the scheme is designed to deal with different types of flooding, so river flooding and coastal flooding primarily, but also a little bit of rainfall surface runoff. Is there a different freeboard allowance in the coastal areas to the riverine flooding?
Yeah, in the coastal areas, it's a slightly different approach, in that we have to consider both predicted and extreme tide levels, but also the impact of waves. So what we have done in the coastal defences is look at what would be tolerable from a wave overtopping perspective. You know, if we wanted to prevent all wave overtopping, you know, we would need flood defences that could be, you know, several metres higher than what we've currently got. If we just said no wave overtopping was tolerable. So within the coastal areas, we have looked at what would be tolerable, in the sense of what kind of spray could be picked up by kind of drainage and dealt with, and that has then set the height of flood defences. In this particular case, it works out something quite similar to the freeboard, but it's a slightly different approach. So the coastal defences are set higher than the predicted extreme tidal levels, but that kind of degree that they are, or that amount that they are higher, is based on limiting wave overtopping to a relatively small amount.
Thank you. That's helpful. Before we move on to talk about the design in particular locations, point B of the questions I wanted to relate to, link to the different aspects that the council has had to consider in terms of coming up with the proposed scheme design. So you've set out various different things in your documents about the conflicting different balancing acts you've had to do, but I wondered if there was anything further the council wanted to sort of highlight in terms of those elements that have influenced the design. You've mentioned some of them about freezer, but other elements.
Yeah, I think, you know, I would refer to the design principles document that we submitted, which I'll reference in a second. I'll find it on the list. So it was document number FC 003.008, which this document identifies the main factors that can affect the proposed flood defence works. You know, there is as you mentioned, there is a kind of balancing act that has to be taken. We are, you know, this particular scheme is looking at defences that are predominantly in an urban industrial area. There is a multitude of physical constraints present, whether that's the location of existing buildings, roads, but we also have to consider, you know, within all these roads, there's generally utilities. We have to look at the environmental impacts, both whether that's wildlife habitats, but also looking at the potential presence of contamination within the ground. So there's a large number of factors that each can have an influence on the type of flood defence that's proposed. Now, it's unlikely that we are going to ever have a situation where we can satisfy all of those requirements. So it's a case of basically considering what we can do to take account of those constraints, whether that's looking at the environmental impacts of a particular option. It could be looking at the complexity, the kind of technical challenges that an option might present, and you know that's usually then linked to cost. So we consider cost. So effectively, when we got down to the kind of preferred flood protection scheme, which was identifying that it was primarily going to be direct defences, and by that I mean either flood defence walls or embankments, we then kind of almost carried out that mini option appraisal in each of the areas, looking at all these different impacts, and trying to come up with what we believed was the kind of best option that, where possible, address the majority of those constraints, and that was something that wasn't just, say, ourselves that looked at. We set up an independent working group within the council to actually, you know, look at the different options in each area that we considered, and feedback any comments, and ultimately, you know, reach agreement on what was taken forward and is presented in the final scheme that was published.
Thank you. And then just sort of following that thought on, I mean, you've mentioned that the approach is very much being one of direct defence, I think is the phrase you use. obviously some of the objectives have questioned whether the focus, if you like, on walls and what I would call hard defences rather than perhaps softer ecological type solutions. I don't know whether you want to comment on how those elements were considered and balanced.
Yeah, sure. I say the initial phase of this project, which commenced back in 2016, 2017, after kind of publication of the flood risk management strategies, was the option appraisal stage, and that ran for at least two years. That process, and as part of that process, we considered alternatives to the direct defences that we ended up with. So those alternatives did include on the River Carron and the Grange burn, did look at flood storage in the upper catchment and creating basically large reservoirs that in normal circumstances would be empty, but during a flood event they would fill with water, which would be released at a slower rate and therefore reduce the flood risk downstream. We then also look at conveyance improvements, whether that was dredging of the channels or even incorporating, a new flood relief channel. That was particularly on the River Carron, and we did consider others like tidal barriers for tidal flooding. But what we found is, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, in the Grangemouth we are dealing with both fluvial and coastal flooding, so it's quite a complex flooding mechanism. We also have three main rivers, the River Carron, Grangeburn and River Avon, as well as the fourth estuary that all influence flooding within Grangemouth. And what we found is that, if I look at flood storage as an example, we did find that would be effective to a degree on the River Carron, but most of the flood risk in the River Carron, particularly kind of Dock Street and downstream, is driven by tidal levels. So putting flood storage upstream has absolutely no impact on tidal flood risk. So we still needed flood defences pretty much in the same areas that we've ended up with flood defences to address that tidal flood risk. And we also identified that some of the options to deal with tidal flood risk, such as a barrier on the Grange burn, a tidal barrier on the Grange burn we looked at, actually had potential to make flood risk worse. Because when that barrier is closed, it doesn't stop all the water coming down the water courses that have to be stored behind the barrier. And we actually found that in a combination of events, we could actually increase flood risk. So there was, a lot of effort spent early on in the project looking at these alternatives. It wasn't a decision to go straight to, the flood defence walls and embankments. We did consider a range of feasible alternatives, but ultimately we found that the direct defences was the most appropriate given the flood risk within Grangemouth.
Thank you. If I could move on then about different balancing acts for things other than just sort of straight scheme design. So I'm sure that the various different factors had to be balanced. And one of the objectives has been referring to perhaps other policies that the council have in terms of sustainable development, sustainability targets, and cost obviously being mentioned in a number of the objections. So are you able to provide just a little bit more information to me about how these different aspects, these other not conflicting but different policies, I suppose, have been balanced against the requirements for the design of the flood scheme?
Yeah, I think, as I kind of mentioned earlier, kind of looking, I suppose, at that kind of sustainability, and in that particular objector, I think I'd have to say I would disagree with the the comments they made and what a more sustainable approach would be. The objector suggested that the defences should be realigned to essentially protect existing undeveloped floodplain in that particular case, and suggested that rather than having defences that were set back considerably from the edge of the watercourse, that we should effectively construct a flood defence embankment right on the edge of the riverbank, which was something that we discounted early on, given it goes against one of our main principles, which is to protect existing floodplain where possible. It would also, if we were excavating and constructing on the riverbank, would inevitably lead to significantly greater environmental impacts. So I would, in terms of that particular comment, query that, they were challenging that the option that they've taken forward wasn't sustainable, and that alternative that I've just described of protecting floodplain and digging up riverbank was a more sustainable approach. It would have also increased the length of flood defences by about a factor of 4 in that location. So in our view, that alternative was a significantly less sustainable option than what we've adopted. You kind of mentioned cost as well, and I think that's evident in some of the technical notes that we've referred to that look at alternatives that were considered in specific areas, and cost was one of the considerations there. It didn't always necessarily mean that we would adopt the lowest cost solution, because we have to again balance what are the other impacts, whether that's environmental, social, the technical challenges. So yeah, all of these factors influence the design to a certain extent. And yeah, I say that's kind of evidenced in some of the technical notes that we've provided in the document list.
And just following that thought through then, was there a cost benefit analysis done for different areas and the benefits? And so what was it, was the cost benefit analysis done for the scheme as presented that I'm considering, or was it done by section to determine the benefits of different structures?
Yeah, the cost benefit analysis was kind of probably first undertaken back at the option appraisal stage. So when we were considering the different options, whether that was the kind of flood storage and base improvements that I mentioned, cost benefit was one of the considerations, as well as the kind of predicted carbon impacts. It's something I meant to just mention earlier, that was also considered at the option appraisal stage. So yeah, the cost and the benefits was a factor that influenced the choice of ultimately led to the preferred scheme being identified. But even beyond that, cost was still a consideration when we were looking at alternatives at specific locations. And ultimately, sorry, there was a cost benefit of the published scheme. That was evidence published.
Okay, just to pursue that, then obviously I appreciate it's an interim system, so it's difficult to do a bit of it without doing this scheme as designed as a whole. But were there that balancing that done, for example, was it worth including the chapel burn or not including the chapel burn? Is it worth including bits on the Carron or not including the Carron? How was that kind of assessment undertaken?
Yeah, I think if anything, that kind of assessment led to additional areas actually being included within the scheme. The initial, there's I think in everything that's kind of upstream of the M9 on the Grangemouth, when we first started out back in kind of 2016, 2017, at that stage, we didn't believe there was a significant risk of flooding upstream of that point, so there was no defences anticipated, but through the work that we did, we ended up extending the model, identifying areas that were at risk and they were included within the scheme. I suppose there was going back to that the cost benefit. We didn't, whilst we might have not done a specific cost benefit on an individual area, the cost of the proposed scheme did influence whether certain properties were protected. So we have, there is properties on the Grangemouth of the Stirling Road, which are owned by one of the objectors, and the two residential properties there aren't protected by the scheme. And that was primarily due to the estimated costs of protecting those properties being probably at least a magnitude greater than the anticipated value of those properties. And similarly, further downstream on the River Carron, at one stage we were looking to protect Carron House, which is a B-listed building downstream of Dock Street. But that was again subsequently removed from the area being protected because the costs, and not just the cost, the kind of environmental impact of the proposed defences to protect that, which would have resulted in significant loss of woodland and I think possibly ancient woodland, just meant that it was unfeasible for protecting one individual property. I think more recently, the council have been looking at the cost benefits of the residential elements of the scheme on their own, and we have kind of demonstrated that even if you were just to protect residential areas, the benefits still are greater than the anticipated costs in those areas. But yeah, I think like you say, it's quite again just the flooding mechanisms within Grangemouth. It's kind of very difficult to just leave out a specific area, or there is examples that I've given, but in most cases, if there would be significant risks to properties if you left out defences in particular areas.
Thank you. I think that deals with my generic questions. Some of those points we may well come back with as we progress through and look at perhaps the individual places, but we'll see. Just before we do move on to the sort of specific design in particular areas, I just wanted to pick up on terms of the level of detail for the design plans and have an understanding of how much detail it's anticipated would be at this point of the process, and how much design would take place after the next stage should Falkirk Council decide to proceed with the scheme.
Yeah, I think at this stage, the level of information that's been provided on the scheme plans and within the operations is as kind of described in the 2010 regulations, that we have to identify basically the kind of form of flood defence we're proposing, the land that's affected by those flood defences, and also provide sufficient information that people can basically identify their own property boundaries. So the information that's on the scheme plans complies with the 2010 regulations, and it's a similar level of detail to all of the published schemes that I've been involved in, and looking at the information that's made available by other schemes that kind of that we've not been involved with have been published. So, some people might consider it as quite basic information that, and it's essentially, it shows whether something's a flood defence wall or embankment, the land that's affected, to construct that. And there is plans that shows the kind of wider land affected by the scheme. But it isn't, it is not detailed design, it is not information that you would be able to construct the scheme from. That would come at the detailed design phase. And I say in all projects, similar projects I've been involved with, and I think most in kind of Scotland, that detailed design stage occurs after the scheme has been confirmed, because it is it's a significant part of the overall development of the scheme, and it requires significant, so there's a significant cost associated with that detailed design stage, and so it's not normally carried out at this stage. Although, I would say that, in the case of Grangemouth, there's certain areas that we'll come on to later, where more effort has been undertaken at this stage than you would possibly expect or would be normal, to ensure that what we're proposing, is actually feasible, it's buildable, but that level of detail might not actually be reflected specifically on the plans that are published. So the plans that are published are those that's required under the 2010 regulations.
Could I just pick up a little bit on that, just to give reassurance that the level of information gathered at this stage to do the scheme alignment and the published plans is sufficient for the information we require, and gives us the reassurance that the defences could be built in those locations. So, for example, there's sufficient topographic information, environmental information, ground and site information to give us that level of detail to prepare the scheme plans and the scheme estimates. But as Alan alluded to, there will be further investigation work required to develop that more detailed design for each of those phases, and that will be done there's envisaged that will be done in a sequential process. So we'd start in one area, take that information to that greater level of detail to prepare the construction plans in those areas before then move into the next phases.
And I'll just to follow up on that, just to so the position outlined by Mr. McGowan and Mr. Dawson is also consistent with the Scottish Government guidance, which we have lodged at document FC 10/008, and particularly page 10 of that. I can just read out. I don't know if anyone wants to take time to get that document, but there is a statement that says it is imperative that flexibility is built into the description of the operations and land affected, so as to allow for foreseeable changes as the scheme has progressed. This will allow the authority to make allowance for uncertainty in terms of detailed design and manage risk to delivery of the scheme. So the guidance itself recognises that there will be an element of uncertainty at this stage, and that will be refined through detailed design.
Thank you very much. Okay, then, if we start to move into part E, which is dealing with very specific queries, I suppose, that have been identified in different locations. And I sort of listed this when I thought a number of the objectives were wanting to be present to discuss these things. But I've got a few questions that I just want to be thought through. I'm clear on the situation. So I'm going to start off in the sort of Caronshaw area, and I think we've already sort of talked about this in broad terms around the Dock Street area, and we've already mentioned, I think, the embankment approach there. So I was going to ask you the approach that you've taken to the design in that particular area, and the rationale for putting the defences further back from the river rather than following the river edge.
Yeah, I think the approach that was taken there was, initially, there's a large area of undeveloped land on the inside of a significant meander in the River Carn at that point. So I suppose kind of the first, the two main influences on the alignment of defences there were one, there is no development on that site to protect. It's used for exercising and grazing kind of horses at present. But secondly, it is part of the floodplain of the River Carn. So there, those two, I would say, are the main factors in deciding that, taking a flood defence around the boundary of that land wouldn't be appropriate. It would be protecting floodplain, which, protecting floodplain has the potential of increasing flood risk downstream by removing the kind of storage capacity within the floodplain. But probably as important was the fact that there is no property there to protect other than the land itself, and to protect that land, I say, would result in flood defences that were probably 4 or 5 times the length of the defences that we have proposed in that location. The specific alignment of the flood defences through that land basically followed the property boundaries. I think that was kind of challenged by, I think, 2 objectors who I think had similar information that we were provided with from Registers of Scotland. We followed the boundaries that were in there, but there seemed to be some kind of uncertainty, because I think the owner of the stables, I think, grazes land that is actually owned by the residents and the residential properties to the north. There's no fence that separates the land, so I think there seemed to be a kind of assumption that because that's used for grazing of horses, that it forms part of the land owned by the stables, but that's not the case when you look at Registers of Scotland. The alignment of flood defences follows what we believe is the boundary between the land ownership in that location, and it retains the existing floodplain.
I'll just ask you a couple of supplemental questions about that then. The first one being that it's been mentioned to me that the scheme is meant to be flexible, and the guidance is suggesting flexibility. Is that something that there would be scope there for altering, given that the rationale seems to have been dictated by property boundaries rather than flood risk? Is that somewhere where there'd be flexibility for moving the absolute location?
I think but whilst the guidance refers to kind of flexibility, there's no defined process within the 2009 Act or the 2010 or 17 regulations that specifically deal with moving flood defences when a scheme is confirmed. Approaches have been taken on other schemes where that has been necessary. I would say that probably any changes haven't been, or generally any changes that have been made, probably in other schemes have been viewed as kind of non-material, and that they are relatively small changes. So that might be, straightening out the alignment of a flood defence, or the position of the flood defence might move by a relatively small amount, so that they can overall, whether it's the environmental impacts are no different. But any kind of significant change in alignment of flood defences is, I suppose, it would be something that would have to be considered by the local authority in conjunction with all their planning teams to view whether a change was significant. It also does, and it's probably something that we'll get on to later, that when a council, when a flood protection scheme is confirmed and we've gone through the kind of appeals process and it becomes operative, the council then have powers that they can exercise to enter land to construct the flood defences. So often defences are constructed on land that the council doesn't own. So that would also need to be a factor that was considered that if there was any changes proposed to the alignment, because that might be something that's objected to by the owners of that land. So yeah, kind of making modifications. I don't want to use modifications in the sense of formal modifications, which could come out of this process, but yeah, changing kind of flood defences. There's no specific approach in the legislation or guidance, or certainly the regulations of how that's done. But I'm aware through experience in all schemes that that does routinely happen, but they are, I would say, very minor changes that are made. If there was anything more significant, it would probably need separate planning permission, and also could be done. The powers can, the council can do these works separate to a confirmed scheme if they do it by agreement with land and property owners.
Thank you. And when I was out on site and looking, and also from the objectives you've mentioned, there's sort of that there's a sort of light low bund, I suppose, around the edge, and it looked quite high above the water level. So that that scoop of land, if you like, is part of the floodplain you're describing to me. So is that assuming that bund, which I understand from the documents, is not an official flood defence removed, or is that still functioning as floodplain even with that small bund in place? Do you know?
Yeah, I think at present that kind of bund that runs along the edge of the watercourse, it's certainly not high enough to contain the 1 in 200 year event. But it would, my recollection is that it first overtops just behind the stable building on Dock Street, and then would start to inundate that area. But as you say, that existing bund isn't a formal flood defence. It was probably constructed by those that were working the land at some point in the future. But often these types of bunds are constructed from material that's dredged from the river, that's basically just scraped up. So it's not a proper engineered flood defence, and I certainly, it's not something that I think you would rely on as being robust and an effective flood defence, although it probably does offer some protection to the land. But if we were to get something like a 200-year flood event, whether that bund would still be standing after it, that may not be the case. It will depend on how well it was constructed, but generally these things aren't very well constructed. They're certainly not constructed in the same way as a proper flooding embankment would be, with impermeable materials that are compacted, and these tend to be just material that's scraped out and just deposited on the edge of the watercourse.
Thank you. And you mentioned the principle there of trying to place these defences, safeguard the existing floodplain. Is that a principle that's been applied throughout the whole scheme?
Yes, wherever possible. That's what we've tried to do. Obviously, those residential areas or industrial commercial areas that are at risk of flooding, they are within the floodplain. So obviously in those areas where we've positioned flood defences, we're not retaining the floodplain, because if we retained the floodplain, those properties would still be at risk. But in areas like the example of Dock Street that are currently undeveloped, unless there's any other constraint that would have avoided us doing that, that tended to be our starting point, is to set the flood defences as far back as possible from the edge of the watercourse.
you. And just one final point about that, and it's probably a point that will crop up again, is this access through flood defences, and I think that's a particular issue in this area, how that was considered and how that's, whether there's flexibility again in the scheme design to deal with that.
Yeah, in this particular, in that particular location, we've, the kind of general ground levels, particularly where the current access is, are really quite low relative to the predicted flood level and the flood defence level. So we did discuss with the property owner there during a site visit the options for allowing access, because they need access for, understand, they bring horses to and from that location, so they need access for either, cars or vans towing kind of horse box or larger vehicles that are transporting horses. So we did discuss the kind of two main options, which are either we leave a gap in the flood defence that can be infilled with either a floodgate or demountable flood defences, or I think our preference was, which is not what we ended up with, but I think our initial preference was to have a combination of a ramp and either a floodgate or a demountable defence at the top of the flood defence. The kind of benefit of that approach is with the ramp that you have some protection from the flood defences in the ramp, because the point where vehicles pass through the wall isn't down at the kind of existing ground level. It's what could be like halfway up the height of the flood defence. But the discussions that we had on site with the landowner was that he wasn't keen on that approach and would prefer just a floodgate at that location. So that's what has been incorporated within the published scheme. It's just a gate that during kind of forecast of a flood event, that the council would be responsible for closing that gate. It would normally be in the open position to provide kind of unhindered access to that land, but during a flood event, the gate would need to, or the forecast of a flood event that was severe enough that it could result in water kind of passing through the floodgate. That gate would need to be closed by the council. I would say, sorry, that there probably is, there is flexibility in the sense of the exact position of that gate or the exact width. I think we allowed a 5 or 6 metre wide gate from memory at that location.
Thank you. If we just then move round the corner a little bit up towards where the Chapel Burn comes in, and obviously there are a number of objections that have come in from the sort of Water's End and the Meadows area. We've talked about it a little bit, so actually just talk me a little bit more through the design, because obviously the land does look quite high above the river there, and particularly in terms of the Chapel Burn. So perhaps just a little bit more explanation of the rationale for the proposed scheme there.
Yeah, I think I would agree in that location. That land is higher than other areas of the scheme, so it might not, the properties there aren't at risk for the more frequent flood events that would occur. But again, they are at risk when we look at the design flood event, which is the 1 in 200 year event. And I see that generally has been across the scheme area. That's what the level of protection that the scheme is seeking to provide. We haven't, we did talk earlier that in certain areas that Freeboard has maybe been adjusted, but in general we're always trying to provide the 200-year standard of protection, rather than saying Water's End will provide you with 50-year standard of protection. And Water's End is felt this isn't something that will specifically be addressed by the scheme, because I mentioned earlier that we haven't allowed climate change for the next 100 years within the height of flood defences. But the kind of Water's End and the residential development that sits behind Water's End is one of the probably areas within the the scheme area where climate change will have the greatest impact on the numbers of properties at risk. I think we did address that in the response to one of the objectors in that area. So the scheme won't protect against that future flood risk, but as flooding becomes more severe in the future, the defences there will be used more frequently. And at some point, again, depending on what actually happens with climate change in the future, that is an area that we could see that could be a considerably lower risk in the future. So providing flood defences in that area will offer protection to those properties now, but will also help in the future when decisions may need to be made on increasing level of protection at those locations.
I observed when I was out that there seemed to be quite strong evidence of erosion along the bank along that side, and I didn't know whether the flood defence scheme was designed partly, it's not just about avoiding the water, but obviously the speed and the direction that it's moving in, and I think everyone wanted to add any comments about that in terms of design.
Yeah, it's certainly something that, and again, it's one of the reasons, partly linked, not just at that location of looking to set flood defences back from the edge of watercourses, because the closer they are to a watercourse, then, as you point out, there's the greater risk of erosion and scour. And and in some locations that's unavoidable, and ultimately the design of the flood defences in those areas will allow for that erosion to take place. In other areas where we have set it back quite a considerable distance, we might not design the defences to allow for erosion, because it might be unreasonable to expect that you would get 10-20 metres of erosion. The council would probably, if there was ever evidence of that amount of erosion taking place, I'm quite sure the council would take action long before it got to the point that flood defences were undermined. But yeah, in that particular location, in areas, the flood defence, particularly when you go round onto the River Carron, it's quite a steep bank there. There is evidence of erosion, and that will have to be taken into account in the detailed design of the scheme. And that may include reinforcing the existing river bank, or repairing it and reinforcing it. Or it may be in some locations that you design the flood defences that if that erosion took place and it took place all the way up to the flood defence, that the flood defence will still be stable and won't be undermined. So again, it's that's where kind of the detailed design would really kind of firm up on the kind of specific details of whether we reinforce the river bank or whether we just design the flood defences that if the river bank erodes, it's not going to undermine the defences.
Thank you. Before we leave the River Carron, I wonder if we can move upstream quite a bit to the Stirling Road area, which, as you know, there's an outstanding objection to. You've already alluded to that, and I don't know whether it's helpful to have possible to get the scheme design up. I think is it cell 1, sheet 3, something like that. Just if it's tricky, don't worry. I've got a page copy. Just to understand the rationale of the location of the footboard, which seems to come out and do 3 sides of the square around the property and then back to the riverbank. So easy. Otherwise, we can just look at our electronic copies.
Just get Kathy just a minute to look the plan up.
Might have a different sheet. It's sort of just on the very edge. I think it's a bit tricky to work it out exactly where it is.
The document number is FC 001 18.
I think it's actually going to get shared from the other computer. So.
I reckon you can just,
Yeah.
but I think we probably, I'm sort of familiar with the structure, so if we just want to perhaps talk us through.
Yeah, so I think at that particular location, on the kind of north side of Stirling Road, so between Stirling Road and the River Carn, there is 2 residential properties and there is 2 commercial properties. They are all owned by the one family. Now the scheme at present, you know, follows the kind of back of the north side of the footpath along Stirling Road. So and that comes from kind of the west and kind of the flood defences kind of along west to east, kind of following the back of the footpath of Stirling Road. It doesn't actually protect the 2 residential properties, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, that we did look at options for protecting those residential properties. The cost of those defences, I think it's in one of the Stirling Road's technical note that we published, but the cost of those defences was going to be into several £1 million to protect the 2 individual properties. I think one of them was a kind of timber, well, from outside it appears to be a kind of timber log cabin type construction. And part of the reason that costs were so expensive on that section is that there is a corner of one of the existing properties that is only about, it's a couple of metres away from the edge of almost vertical riverbank that's about 3-4 metres in height. So any flood defence that would go in there would effectively be retaining a kind of 4-metre height difference between the riverbed and the property, and would likely require quite extensive engineering to be able to be stable, which may involve having some kind of high rods basically extending underneath the property. So it was going to be a really expensive form of flood defence to construct. The impacts and how we would actually construct that, given its location in the river, were going to be very difficult, and there would be environmental issues associated with that. So it wasn't something that a decision was taken quickly to decide not to protect that property or those 2 properties. There was significant kind of discussions, and that included, as I mentioned earlier, we set up a kind of separate working group to consider the outcomes that we were kind of presenting, and ultimately kind of agreed that in that particular location, that those 2 residential properties wouldn't be protected. But you did mention the kind of flood defences kind of coming in and out there. So the flood defences, when they get past the residential buildings, then there's almost like a square that they go behind so on the riverward side of the 2 commercial properties, but the flood defences in that location are lower than the main flood defence. There is still a flood defence wall that continues along Stirling Road. So again, those 2 commercial properties aren't really protected by the scheme, because the flood defence wall that goes around the north side of those defences, the main purpose of that flood defence is to offset the increase in flood level that is caused by the defences upstream. So this is something I kind of didn't mention earlier, but it's part of our consideration of when we put flood defences in an area, they do change the kind of hydraulics within the water course. So you can find, because the flood defences are protecting property and therefore reducing the floodplain, the storage that those properties are built on, that can lead to increases in flood level and the water goes downstream. So that's something that's considered as part of the whole approach and the design. And you know, we model both the current situation, but we model the situation with defences in place. And it's that scenario that's used to set the height of flood defences. So in some locations, the predicted water level for say a 200-year event does increase. And those two commercial properties were where we did predict an increase in flood level because of the defences upstream. So the smaller flood defence wall that goes around the north side of those properties is to ensure that those two commercial properties aren't in a worse position from a flood risk point of view than they are just now. That if they have 1 in 20-year standard of protection just now, you know, they will still have that for the scheme is constructed, so we aren't adversely affecting them from a flood risk point of view. So that's the kind of justification of the defences there. It wasn't found necessary to do the same thing for the two residential properties upstream, but yeah, we're essentially kind of mitigating the impacts of flood defences upstream.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, we've sort of actually got two different levels of flood defence there. The two commercial properties are going to retain the existing level of flood risk that they have at the moment because of the low wall proposed around the building.
Yeah, that's
But the main road would be maintained at the 1 in 200-year protection.
Yes.
And that's why we've got this unusual shape. Okay, I'm just going to deal with Zetland Park, then we'll take a short break because I anticipate the section C of the docs will take us a little while. So everyone just bear with me for another 5-10 minutes and we'll deal with my queries for Zetland Park and then take a very short break. So obviously there are a number of objections about the Zetland Park area, particularly the effects of proposals on trees and the tree-lined areas, and we'll talk about trees later in the agenda. But as a sort of generic approach, I suppose, could you just sort of talk me through the approach with Zetland Park? And I think there's a technical paper, isn't there, that deals with the different options at Zetland Park.
Yeah.
And so perhaps just focus perhaps on how you came up with that solution and how you felt that was minimising the effects on trees whilst achieving the design.
I think the technical note on Zetland Park does specifically deal with the park. But it's possibly worth just going almost kind of back a step. So Zetland Park sits on the Grangemouth, and we did look at a number at the option appraisal stage, a number of different options for protecting those properties along the Grangemouth. So one of the options that we had, which was subsequently discounted, was basically to have flood defences along both banks of the Grangemouth, literally from the M9, where it comes under the M9, all the way down to the kind of port and the petrochemical plant, where it would continue with the flood defences there. Now that particular option would have a much more significant impact on the trees that line the Grangemouth, but one of the alternative options and what's in the published scheme is basically to introduce a flow control structure at the upstream end of the Grangemouth. So just where the Grangemouth comes under the M9, then the Grangemouth itself carries forward in a northerly direction. I'm not sure if you visited this area, but you have the start of the flood relief channel at that point. So what the alternative option and what's in the preferred scheme is to incorporate a flow control structure that will divert more of the water down the flood relief channel, and there is proposals to upgrade the flood relief channel to both deal with that increase in flow, but also the channel is in need of fairly major repair works in places. So by putting in that flood relief channel, we significantly reduce the flow during like a 200-year event. It's passing forward down the Grange Burn through Zetland Park and through the kind of town of Grangemouth itself. So by doing that, we significantly reduce where the locations where flood defences are proposed, which in turn does have a significant impact then on the numbers of trees potentially affected. And I think it's just worth kind of noting that point, because the concerns around Zetland Park are known and understood, and we have spent a lot of time looking at alternatives there to minimise the impacts. But ultimately, whilst we've reduced the flow by the flow control structure, Zetland Park is still within the tidal reach, and the flood risk in that area is driven primarily by high tides or extreme tides. So even though we've reduced the flow, it doesn't get rid of the need for flood defences. So the flood defences that we do have kind of from Zetland Park downstream are primarily to deal with tidal flood risk. But within Zetland Park itself, again, we are well aware of the kind of sensitivities around the park and felling trees, and and it's not our strategy just to get rid of trees. It's we are trying to retain trees where we can, but kind of going right back to one of the initial points, there are so many other constraints that we have to consider, that if we can protect trees and avoid taking them down, we have done that. And I think the Zetland Park, when you look at the evolution of the kind of design there, I think the final design within Zetland Park, and when I say this to avoid kind of any confusion, we're taking Zetland Park as being on the east side of the Grange Burn. So the final design only proposes that 9 trees are felled within Zetland Park on the east side. Whereas I think some of the initial proposals, we were probably 80, 90 trees, and if you visited that location, you'll appreciate there's kind of 3 main avenues of trees down there. And I will come on to Abbots Road, because there is an avenue of trees that we can't avoid felling, but within the park side itself, we've now, through a combination of changing the alignment of the flood defences and looking at probably quite significant kind of pruning back of some of the trees to such that the kind of root zone that those trees need is reduced during the kind of construction phase. With a combination of that and the alignment of flood defences, we now have reduced it to 9 trees that need to be felled. The west side of the watercourse is a slightly different issue. Some people might still class that within Zetland Park, and we tend to refer to that as kind of Abbots Road. But if you're visited there, you'll know that there's an existing wall that I think we believe was constructed as part of the Grange Burn scheme, that was constructed in the late 50s, early 60s, which also resulted in the flood relief channel being constructed. But that existing flood defence wall, the trees are extremely close to that existing wall, and then we've got Abbots Road basically right next to the wall. So we did have an option of, can we reduce Abbotston Road even just to one-way traffic and to allow the flood defence to be moved out, but kind of discussions with I think it was kind of emergency services. They were extremely concerned with that option, and as were the the roads authority as well, because it is a busy road, and it's also part of, I believe, the kind of main route if I thought there was an emergency at the petrochemical plant. So there was a lot of concern of reducing that road to one width, to one lane. So the only real location that you could construct a new wall is where the existing wall is, but I say the trees are, in places probably a metre offset from that wall. So in that location, we don't believe it's possible to retain that avenue of trees. So they are going to have to be felled to enable construction of the defences. But we are proposing that there's obviously replacement planting that's put in those locations. But yeah, a lot of effort has went into reducing the impacts in Zetland Park, and the final scheme that was published, the impacts on trees are significantly reduced from some of the early designs that were taken forward.
Thank you. And just, you raised a couple of interesting points there in terms of identifying the main flood risk was from sea flooding and so on. So has that influenced then the need to go for the wall approach? Because you've already mentioned to me that it's often a principle, if possible, to allow flooding into the floodplain, which one might argue the park would be considered part of the floodplain. But is the fact that it's sea flooding as opposed to flooding from the Grangemouth one of the influencing factors?
No, there is still, the flood defences that are proposed as part of the scheme are dictated by the tidal flood risk, but there is still a fluvial flood risk, not to the same extent as tidal. We did have an option of putting the flood defences around the boundary of the park, and I think that was considered at the option appraisal stage. But the feedback that we got then, both from Friends of Zetland Park, which was a group that was set up, there was a lot of work done in Zetland Park as part of a lottery funded project, and we engaged with Friends of Zetland Park, and also those who used the park or lived in proximity. One of there was two things came up through that. One, the boundary of the park pretty much is tree lined as well, so you couldn't locate the flood defences right on the boundary of the park, or essentially you have the same kind of issues that you need to remove a lot of trees. But there was and I would say this is kind of maybe a misunderstanding, but when we had that option, we did show that in fluvial scenarios the park would still flood. But a lot of people misunderstood that to mean that we were deliberately flooding the park, whereas we were kind of trying to convey that this will happen. If we get that event just now, the park is going to flood, and I think there is extensive flooding within the park, primarily just now probably due to surface water. But there was real opposition to that option because it was perceived that we were going to deliberately damage the park by flooding. And we have came across that kind of similar view further upstream on the flood relief channel where you get Rannoch Park, that we are predicting that there'll be more flooding of Rannoch Park, and people perceive that to be a significant issue, whereas in other places, both in Scotland and wider, parks are frequently used as for temporary flood storage. There's a whole scheme in Edinburgh that utilises Inch Park as part of the flood protection scheme. But yeah, we did come across as much opposition to that alternative alignment to the alignment that that is part of the published scheme.
Thank you for clarifying that. Just one last small question, again, picking up on one of the points in one of the objections, which is this discussion about whether trees are actually helping to suck up water and whether the loss of trees in the park is going to add to, I suppose, the flooding you see.
Yeah, I think, yeah, this is a point that we come across, sorry, yeah, this is a point we come across quite a lot, and, you know, I'm not denying that trees will absorb water, but when you are looking at a flood protection scheme, and in our particular case, something that's looking at, you know, a kind of 1 in 200-year event, when you start to consider the, you know, the volumes of water that we're talking about, you know, I think from memory in the Grange burn, you know, the 1 in 200-year peak flow is, I think, around about 60 cubic meters of water every second. You know, I don't believe there's any trees that would absorb that amount of water, and particularly over a, you know, a very short period of time. You know, as I said, you know, Zetland Park is in an area that's dictated by tidal flooding, so, you know, we have, you know, 2 tides or high tides a day. You know, the trees are not going to absorb the volume of water that would prevent, you know, tidal flooding. And again, once we haven't had flooding in that area that's affected property, you know, probably every year, you know, there is evidence of the water level coming right up to, you know, the top of that existing wall that's there at present, and these aren't, you know, the extreme tides we're designing against. These are just high kind of spring tides that, so those existing trees aren't stopping those tides from reaching those levels just now. So, you know, the trees aren't going to, you know, prevent, you know, a 1 in 200-year tide level from occurring. I don't think it matters how many trees you can plant down there. You know, they aren't going to absorb that level of water in that period of time that, they're effective. There's obviously biodiversity, you know, they are important from that point of view, but in terms of managing flood risk, you know, they aren't going to make a measurable difference to predicted water levels. Yeah, and we are, I suppose, just to point on that kind of trees, you'll probably cover it later, but, you know, we are looking to plant, particularly in the Zetland Park area, where, you know, we're going to plant, you know, very large replacement trees rather than just saplings. So we probably will be planting in the Zetland Park area on a kind of 1-to-1 ratio, one planted for every 1 felled. But overall, within the scheme, we're aiming to plant at least 3 trees on average for every 1 that is felled.
Thank you everyone for your patience. I'm going to propose we take a short break now, and then come back to discuss the scheme design in more detail around the docks area, which is my 3rd bullet point on item 2 of the agenda. So if we come back at 11:45, to carry on. We're going to continue with the discussion about detailed scheme design and move to the docks area. And I'm going to start with Mr. Galt on behalf of Jarvie. I've got your hearing statement, obviously, and your objection, and you've raised various points in that. But at the moment, I'm just primarily interested with the elements that concern you from scheme design. We'll move on to disruption during construction and so on later in the agenda. Perhaps you'd just like to summarise for me the concerns of your organisation about the design and how it affects your property.
Yeah, certainly. On the during the construction phase, the sort of workspace that's required, would probably completely halt our operations as we currently enjoy at the moment. Longer term, the sort of 5-metre impact and the reduced space in our yard would have an impact that we would need to, you know, we would be able to create a workaround with some assistance from the council, and there has been in the response, there has been discussions that they acknowledge impact that it does have in our business, and that there would be willing to be ongoing discussions regarding some ground in the area surrounding Dalgreen Road. But there's no solutions being put forward just now, and it's being sort of discussed that nearer the time, or if it's going to happen, if permission gets granted and the scheme's going ahead, we could possibly arrange something at the time where we would be looking for a commitment. At this stage of what we could expect to sort of mitigate the issues that we're going to suffer in our premises.
So just so I'm clear, I don't know whether it's worth us, they're asking, is it possible to pop up a plan, or I don't know whether the council would find that helpful, just to understand, you're going to lose a strip of land along the north sort of west side of your property, if I remember.
There's a very narrow area, there's a very narrow area section of our yard, where the sort of 5 metre line impedes significantly, but the up to 15 metres workspace that potentially is required during the construction phase would remove our ability to operate the length of the yard that we currently have at the moment.
And is that just taking a strip off, or is it actually dividing your yard in two to make it more awkward?
It would basically divide our yard in two. Almost, we operate goods vehicles to deliver our equipment. The sort of bottom end of the yard is the accommodation division. So we've got heavy goods vehicles that require access to travel the length of the yard to load and offload the units that are coming in and out of hire contract.
Thank you. Do the council want to respond in terms of how the design's been developed in that area, and
Sorry.
land that would be lost, the design of the scheme at that point?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, so on that plan there shows part of the site that is up into the kind of southwest. But again, I would refer to the technical note relating to Dalgreen Road himself too. That's one of the council's documents. So we did look at all alternatives within this area to align the flood defences. One of the I suppose kind of drivers for the kind of alignment is the very poor condition of the existing riverbank that's there just now, and there's evidence of the kind of application of kind of old timber wharf being in existence. So again, when we were looking at the proposed flood defences, one of the considerations I mentioned earlier was the kind of technical and complexity of what would be required to implement a flood defence, and also looking at kind of environmental impacts and cost. And what we found was that it would be extremely costly to put the flood defence closer to the existing to the river Carn, so moving it north, just because of that existing riverbank and the old wharf. So we've set the flood defence back sufficiently that should that existing riverbank or wharf structure fail in the future, it's not something that would impact on the stability of the flood defence. I suppose commenting on the kind of construction phase impacts, that whilst we've indicated, I don't think on that plan can read it, it looks like a that's 7.5 or 10 metre wide strip either side of the flood defence, so the kind of purple magenta lines are the limit of land that the council would have powers of entry upon to construct the flood defences. That it's not necessarily the case that the council would fence off that area in its entirety during construction. The kind of approach to construction is something, again, we would, it would normally be discussed with the affected land and property owners to try and come up with a specific kind of phasing plan that reduces the disturbance. There obviously still going to be some disturbance during the construction, but we would be, looking to probably do it in sections such that as much of the kind of yard was still available to Jarvie plant during the construction phase, and we would kind of move along the length of that. It's it's highly unlikely that, and this applies again to other areas, that you're not going to fence off huge lengths when you're not going to be working in those lengths all of the time. So we'd be looking to do what we can in terms of the phasing to minimise disruption by doing it in shorter, or potentially doing it in shorter sections. But again, that's not something that would be normal to reflect that sequence at this stage. And then again, I suppose an aspect to that's possibly unique to this scheme, but because this scheme is so large in comparison to any other scheme, the overall phasing of this scheme is going to be done over a much longer period of time. And given where we are now, it's potentially, I'm not saying this is definitely the case, but it could be potentially 10-15 years before works are considered in this area. So, the business that's operating there now, it could be quite different in 10-15 years. And I kind of do have experience from another scheme that I worked on where we had a similar impact, and we spent a huge amount of time trying to develop a kind of phasing strategy this kind of time. But 2-3 years later, when it came to actually constructing that, the business had changed, or how they operated had changed, and that plan that we came up with was essentially useless. We had to kind of go back to the drawing board and come up with a new plan. So it's part of the reason that we've tried not to kind of be so specific at this stage of how this would be constructed, recognising that this could be 10 years before we're doing construction in that area, and it might look quite different, and how we mitigate those impacts might be quite different. So to try and firm up something now for something that's quite a time in the future is, I would question the value in kind of doing that, because it's likely to be different when we get out to construction. I don't know, Alistair, if there's anything else you want to add.
No, just the thing, picking up on what Mr. Gold said, obviously the council has recognised that there needs to be ongoing engagement, and there's been some discussion already with representatives from Jarvie Plant. And we have identified some potential options for that mitigation works, and what alternative plan might be made available. But as Alan alluded to, I think at this stage it's very difficult to come up with a definitive answer to that at this point in time. We do, however, appreciate that as a business, Jarvie Plant need to have some understanding and some forward planning for them as a business. So we're happy to continue those discussions, but at this point in time, what we're seeking to do is get a wall alignment agreed, that element of it is confirmed. And then as we move forward into that detailed design phase and start to think more about the sequence of construction, we can continue those conversations.
Mr. Galt, just so that I'm clear, if the scheme were confirmed and if the wall were built as shown on that plan, is the available space available for you to continue your business, or is these discussions about alternative land for the long term once the scheme was approved, if it was approved.
Yeah, we would hope that the discussions would happen sooner rather than later on the longer term use of the additional land. During the course of the construction phase, the impact would be huge. We couldn't operate the way we do now if we had to lose 15 metres. You see, what the gentlemen are saying that it would be potentially done in phases. But without knowing what these phases are, we can only report on how we operate as a business now, with the number of employees and the level of business we do at Grangemouth. We can't foresee 10 years down the line, any more than you can. So we have to report based on our business model at present.
And if the scheme were constructed and after the construction works were complete, the remaining area within inside the boundary of the flood protection wall would be sufficient on your current estimates, or you would still require additional land?
It would be more manageable. We possibly we still require additional land. It's quite a significant, I think it's about 450 metres long, 5 metres wide. It's a significant chunk of land off of what is a long, narrow site. Unfortunately, the plan on the screen doesn't really show our yard as it is. I've got a drawing here, I've got a plan here that would maybe let you see.
I did drive round. Obviously I didn't drive into the yard
Yeah.
last week, but I did drive past and have a good look.
And if we were, one of the people that's on the list of potential visits, obviously we would welcome that. If that was something that you were considering. But this plan here, will give you a better idea of what impact it would have.
And have you suggested to the council any alternatives in terms of alignment, or is it just you want to have discussions about how the process could be managed, if I can put it that way?
There has been discussion about a couple of pieces of land. One is basically an undeveloped site round the corner from the depot, and the other is Dalgreen Road. The Dalgreen Road proposition probably works for us. At this moment in time, it's a bus route, so whether there's any actual full thoughts or consideration that could happen, but where we wouldn't be able to access the bottom of the yard through our yard whilst the proposed works were going ahead, we could utilise Dalgreen Road and a bottom access gate that we already have, if that was something that was a serious commitment from the council.
I think it may help you and Mr. Gold document FC 003-006 has some plans that would show the yard of traffic plan, which may help with Mr. Gold's explaining things until you understand it. It's FC 003-006. For example, page 24 of the PDF has that plan.
That's it. As you can see here in the sort of middle section, top of the yard, it narrows significantly. We've got a sort of welfare block along the river bank, site canteen, staff welfare, that would need to be relocated. Basically the sort of 5 metre line that the wall will take encompasses the width of that building. It's at that narrow point that would give us significant issues, whereas Dalgreen Road, as you see, runs to the outside of that red line, will give us an access point at the bottom. So if there was an agreement that could be made, that would be significant. assist us to support the scheme.
So just so that I'm clear, your concerns are not necessarily with whether you're not proposing an alternative location for the flood protection wall, but you are proposing that you need some assistance to deal with the consequences of
Yeah.
where it's been proposed to go.
I had considered what had been mentioned, Mr. McGowan had mentioned earlier, that the wall could be set further back into the riverbank. But I appreciate there's maybe more significant environmental costs and certainly cost implications on that, where the proposed cost is. We also have a large sort of storage shed at the very bottom of the yard, just at that very bottom corner, which the wall, proposed wall line goes through. So I take it that the plans would be that shed would need to be removed. So again, as we get closer to the design discussions, that would be a further discussion.
Does the council want to respond to that in terms of the shelf and then to that? Just wondering, giving you the opportunity if you want to.
I think just for clarification, just on that plan that's kind of shown there, the red line isn't the proposed flood defences that probably most people are aware, but that was one of the alternative options that was considered, which would have, if that option had been taken forward, would have left Jarvie plan at risk of flooding. But yeah, just in case there's any confusion over what that red line is, it's not the final proposed flood defence location.
Again, the plan I have has got the proposed red line, so I appreciate what you're saying, but again, for yourself, if
I've got the full set of the
Right.
plans, so I can see exactly where it runs in relation to your land. I was just interested to understand whether it was the location of the wall or the consequences of the wall going there that were causing you the greatest issue.
it's the consequences of the wall going where the plans are for it to be built.
Thank you. And I note that there's been recent correspondence. I think I was sent a copy of an email on 13th of January. So there's obviously dialogue going on between the council. Is that correct? And Mr. Darling,
Yes, you're correct. There was some correspondence recently. I don't think it really resolves the matter in front of us. It's just essentially saying that those conversations around the impacts of the construction and the mitigation measures during the construction phase still need to be agreed. But I think that's consistent with everywhere across the scheme area. That when you get that detailed design and construction methodology, there will need to be conversations with the appropriate landowners to work out what the alternative access arrangements might be during that construction phase.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else you want to say at this point, Mr. Goldman? I'll bring you in for other things, but in terms
No, I
of
think that
design.
covers, yeah.
Okay,
Thank
thank you. If I can turn now then to full thoughts, thank you for your patience. And I can see from your statement that you've summarised your objections and 5 key issues. And the 5th of those is dealing primarily with construction, which we're going to come to later on the agenda. But for now, I'd like to sort of focus, I suppose, on your key issues 1 through to 4, which to me seem to have the greatest bearing on scheme design. I'm wondering how you might prefer to do this, if we go through each of your 4 issues, perhaps one at a time. Would that make sense?
Yes, ma'am. I think that would be a good way to do it. And I think the concerns are not just in relation to the sort of level of design that has been presented to us, as commented on earlier, but also the lack of any mitigation proposals, particularly in the form of proposed planning conditions. In our experience, it would be normal at this stage to have those for consideration as well, because much is made by the council, certainly in its response to 4 reports about mitigation, but there are no proposals before you in that respect. And our experience, colleague of mine dealt with the White Sands flood protection scheme a while ago, and there was detailed discussion in the inquiry there about conditions. So it's difficult to comment on, because I think there is a role for planning conditions in relation to design matters as well as
mitigating construction impacts. But I mentioned that by way of just an introduction, and it's really it's not for us to propose planning conditions, as the council ventured to suggest in their statement of the 12th of January in response to the Barbican statement. We did put forward some suggestions for the kind of issues we'd expect planning conditions to deal with, so far as design and other matters is concerned. But it's the council scheme, not for port scheme. So I'll leave it at that. But it's difficult in relation to design for that reason, as well as the level of design there is. But if we deal with each of those key issues as you invited me to do, the first was key issue 1, which was that the route of the flood protection wall east of the lock gate will not protect the land from flooding that is required for the energy park, and also the Grangemouth land to the east. And we deal with that in quite some detail. I think Mr. Knox on my right-hand side is probably best placed to talk about Port Port's development aspirations for what we've termed, and I'm referring now to the plan in Appendix 2 to our written statement. We've termed the energy park land and then the Grangemouth land. Mr. Knox, could you just tell us about the aspirations fueled most recently by the Port Green Freeport status to develop those two areas of land?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about that in all the detail. Yeah, I mean, it's for quite some time we have had plans to look at how we can develop available land that we have for development in the Port of Grangemouth, and that's been covered actually by the representations that's been made in local development plans in the past, and particularly in the focus of various energy related projects, one of which we have an option agreement on some of that land just now, which could take the form of kind of energy plans being developed there in the coming years. That aspiration has been taken forward and encompassed in the Port Green Freeport business case. The project itself is identified actually forms a specific part of the economic modelling that's been done for that business case, and the requirement of the land to develop is fundamental to actually ensuring that we can deliver some of the kind of economic value that's presented as part of that business case. And accepting that some of that has evolved since the scheme came to being discussed many years ago, and recognising the scheme's been under discussion for a long time. The port does represent critical national infrastructure, and that being important to a lot of the kind of just transition ambitions that are forming part of Grangemouth's plans that take form in many guises. It's not only just the Port Green Freeport, but you've got the various strands from the Future Industry Board, just transition industrial cluster, Grangemouth. All these forums have a key focus on Grangemouth and how it is going to form a key component part in Scotland's journey as part of the energy transition. And the port is very much a kind of fundamental aspect of that. So the kind of representation regarding that piece of land is really to protect the interest there in terms of deliverability of the developments that are currently under discussion, and equally those that may come under discussion as well as the plans and ambitions for developing that just transition corridor in the Grangemouth complex starts to come to fruition.
And then, if we could maybe taking the key issues out of order, because it's a related point. Our key issue 3, which again I'll ask Mr. Knox to comment on, referred to the fact that the route of the flood protection wall to the western edge of the port would not protect the developed land there from flooding, and we referred to, again, it's on Appendix 2 to our written statement. It says parcel to the northwest. Mr. Knox, could you just say a little bit about that proposed development site as well?
Yeah, again, some of this kind of builds into that the Port Green Freeport proposition, identifying those underdeveloped parcels of land that could form part of solutions for that energy transition piece. And that's identified as an area of land that can be used for projects that's associated with either energy related projects or some of the kind of logistics activities that happen in the port. And again, form part of the Port Green Freeport business case that has recently had its approval, and one that the development team is now looking at pushing forward with the view of delivering that over the coming years.
Thank you. And then we had, going back to key issue 2, the concern there is the alignment of the flood protection wall to the north of North Shore Road has the potential to interfere with or obstruct port activity, by which we meant the transport of wide loads and abnormal indivisible loads. And we therefore propose that the flood protection wall is realigned and set back as far as possible from the existing operational port road. I think for further detail about that, if I could invite Mr. Kerr or Mr. Heaps, as you wish.
Thanks. Modules coming in port can be up to 30 metres wide. A limiting factor is really the lock gates and the ships that bring them in. And once these modules are in the port, we really need to have the ability to move them within the port freely. And these kind of modules would come in to facilitate projects that Mr. Knox talked about in terms of the proposals within Forth Green Freeport and other energy related developments within the port. And some of these would also leave the port, but also transporting them within the port. There is the restriction of that wall on the north side, and particularly a couple of pinch points, which really require the wall to be located as far towards the river as possible.
Thank you. And issue 4, which is a matter for Mr. Heaps shortly, please, is that we pointed out that the design of the port's lock gate and its reliability are utterly critical to the operation of the port. It's the only way into the docks. And the design must be of a high standard to meet the requirements of for both port and flood protection use. And we put forward some suggestions in terms of the detailed design of the lock gate and factors that go to its resilience, including choice of contractor and method of construction, and wanting those to be agreed with us to ensure continued and reliable port access and operation. Mr. Heaps, this has been a matter that you've been dealing with in some detail with the council. I'll come back in a minute to talk about engagement more generally, but in relation to lock gates, what would you like to say?
Good morning, everyone. So we've done really positive works in terms of shortlist assessment for the lock gates, which really got to a MITRE plot arrangement. But within that agreement, we didn't really move forward to technical discussions around about the best impact for increased volume support structure, if that could actually share the gates. The gudgeon and hinge assembly didn't really get worked out either, and clashes with existing services. Also, in terms of construction impact, I think we're going to have a meeting on vessel operations and impact of vessel operations, maintenance and repair, and we continue to access the gates was another topic. Long-term resilience of the gates, the interchangeable gates, mechanical and electrical components are interchangeable just now, and also the operation. I mean, it's the liabilities in another area that we're going to discuss, and just to have the confidence to move forward.
Ma'am, we also, it's embedded in one of the key issues, but just to highlight an important design point which we made was that the flood protection wall should include a demountable portion at the access across the Grange burn, so as not to prevent the port from upgrading that access across the burn as and when the proposals for that land come forward. And the council point out in their response, it's paragraph 311 for your note, that the scheme currently includes 2 floodgates which would provide access to the energy park site and to the Grange burn land. Our view is that that access is not in the right place. If you refer to Appendix 2 to our written statement, we have a little annotation there on the plan showing where the demountable access should be, which is where the current bridge is. So if Mr. Knox wants to just say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is really about the kind of evolution of the development of the board and where we see the need for our land as part of the wider development plans, and it's really recognising access to the parcel of land that's not included in the flood protection scheme that sits across Grangemouth, which it was actually kind of recognised as perhaps being considered as part of the scheme, but we recognise that there's challenges around about that. But certainly the land that sits on the main perimeter of the board is one that's important that we protect, and having the minimal structures in the correct locations to ensure we've got accessibility to parts of the land that may be developed out with the bounds of the scheme is equally important to us, particularly as we try and attract people to use the site where physical infrastructure and barriers can be seen as a barrier to development.
And ma'am, I think we'd also want to just point out, highlight from what we put in writing, that there is, in the context of our talk about development proposals, it's important to highlight that there is very limited land within the tax site yet to be developed, which means that the land that we seek to protect for development and ensure that the scheme, this flood protection scheme, is an enabler for that development, is critical to the Freeport realising its full economic potential. I wanted just to touch, if I may, finally on engagement with the council. You've heard a little bit about that today, and there's quite a lot in writing about it. Very much in your hands as to how much you want to go into this, but certainly our experience is rather different from the picture that the council has painted in its response to our written statement. And again, Mr. Knox has been leading on behalf of the port engagement with the council, and wanted just to give an overview of our experience of that process.
Yeah, I think in general terms, engagement by and large for folks is kind of broadly supportive of the kind of ambitions of what the scheme is looking to achieve. I think the engagement has been frequent. There has been lots of conversations in terms of the areas that both folks have had concerns over, which have been pretty much consistent from probably around about 2019, and the process which really concerns areas in terms of the four areas that we're principally covering just now, the dominant one being the energy park land and the alignment of the defence wall round about that. We've never really got to a point and position of being able to explore alternative solutions to try and see if a compromise position can be found in that problem. I've always been, I suppose, quietly confident that we could find resolutions to the other areas, which we've tried to cover in some of the representations that's been made, particularly around about the North Shore Road aspects of the defence wall and the possibility of demountable structures. But there has never been, I would say, the breadth of looking at what the options could be in terms of a solution for the energy park land that has been, if I use the example of the lock gates and the infrastructure there, we kind of covered quite a lot of long list options to get to a short list of viable options. That same extent of the exercise hasn't been taken in other parcels of land, which I've always found a little bit, they've been a little bit disappointed that we've never actually managed to get to that point of exploring. That we've never actually been able to fully explore what the art of the possible could be with that parcel of land, because as I say, probably around everything else with the port infrastructure has been discussed. I think we are reasonably comfortable and satisfied on. As I say, North Shore Road, I still remain optimistic that we could find a compromise solution for that, which we've tried to outline. The principal area that there had been a I suppose a lack of ability to find a way forward has been that alignment round about the energy park plan.
I think so far as design matters are concerned, those are the key points. There's obviously more detail in our written material, but unless there's anything else, we can assist you with any queries you may have on those issues. I think that's all we need to say.
Thank you. Well, yes, I mean, I will go back through your issues if that's okay with some questions, just to make sure that I can completely clear on all those points. So if we perhaps start with the energy park land, and I don't know whether it's hate to put you on the spot again and be able to pop up a drawing perhaps just to understand what your alternative suggestion would be, and then I can come to the council and find out the derivation of the route that we have proposed and how it might alter based on your suggestions.
I think it's
Well done.
So we're talking about the area in.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah.
It's the area in red at the top of the end.
There's the two areas in general. I mean, there's what's depicted there as the energy park land, and there's also the Grangemouth land. There's kind of two areas there, and I suppose there's a kind of long history that's attached to both of them. And previously, when we had concerns about the initial alignment that's been proposed for the flood defence scheme for protection scheme affected by the blue line, we actually kind of I suppose campaigned a little bit for that through previous works being done through reporters. It's visited sites in the past, and actually recommendations being put to the council back in 2019, 2020. That's suggested that both sites should be included as part of the kind of plan, but we kind of focused it initially on that energy park plan because that is the primary interest in terms of protection of the port. And as is depicted in the diagram there, the blue line kind of cuts across the majority of that site, which we think is certainly a little bit unreasonable in terms of what we've got aspiration for that land, and the request has been to push that towards the perimeter, and there has been explanations and reasons given why that may not be possible, but what is not really clear to us at Four Forks, and certainly myself, is to what extent is it not possible. In responses, there are a lot of feedback about the potential impact it may have, but it's not actually been quantified in terms of the extent of any impact to allow informed decisions and discussion to take place on that. And that's really the kind of primary focus, is to say we've got land that's important to Scotland, it's important to the kind of function of the port as a whole in terms of its site. And looking at some of the changes that's happening in the area and developments that's planned, anything that's kind of restricting the use of that, potentially restricting the use of that site, is likely to put any kind of proposals at a disadvantage in terms of coming to fruition, accepting that there is still uncertainties on the time and when the development of the scheme goes forward, which is equally a consideration. And where we've got proposals just now, I think there's another point to add, and that is referred to the documentation. And I've certainly spent time speaking about the three ports so far in terms of its ambition. A lot of mention gets made of 2032 and developments happening by 2032. I think it's important to draw on a point that you can actually agree a contractual arrangement up to the kind of last day of that 10-year agreement of the three port scheme, and you've got for the 5-year period to actually develop to get benefits. So the term goes broadly more beyond the 2032 period.
And now I'd also point out that, as indeed I believe is the case in England, the 10-year period is capable of being extended, and I think has been extended in England in relation to the Thames report. Just for your note, the reference Mr. Knox made to previous reporter, we did cover that in relation to the Falkirk Local Development Plan 2 in our written statement. It's section 5.1.11 onwards, and as a result of the reporter's recommendation, the spatial strategy map was then amended to be routed around the entirety of the port, including the energy park land and the Grangemouth land.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pause you there because there's some various questions that I'd like to direct perhaps to the council. Two points, I suppose, to start with. The first one is just to talk me through the rationale of where the floods wall is proposed to go at the moment compared to the proposal that has been suggested by Fourth Forks of keeping all of the land, the empty park land, within the boundary of the protection wall. And secondly, whether you feel that the changes in policy that have occurred since the scheme started have influenced the scheme design. If you want to deal with the technical question, sorry, I for a second there. So let me deal with the technical question first, which is the selection of the current proposed route for the wall and why that route is chosen as opposed to calculating the energy part land.
Yeah, I think it's kind of broadly similar to the discussions that we've had the kind of morning on the land at Dock Street. The primary purpose of the scheme is to protect existing properties and development, and that has been applied here. The flood defences, particularly with the energy park site, has been routed, as you can see on that plan. It is tied to the existing development that's on that site, and that principle, which is outlined in our design principles note, that's one of the hearing documents, was to protect existing development and property, and not necessarily seek to protect all land that there may be development aspirations on. So that's the kind of principle I would say point is that we are very much at this location and all locations looking at alignments that protect what is there just now, as opposed to what could be there in the future. Any developer of any land has the option of continuing to develop their land, even if it's on the, referring to it as the wet side of the scheme. And there's examples of that elsewhere where that continues to happen. The scheme doesn't change the designation of land, so the land that's there can still be developed, but it's not necessarily for the council to protect that land to enable development.
Thank you. And then the second question then was linked to the fact, obviously, the scheme has been, as we've already discussed, been developed over a period of time, and the policy land framework has changed within that time. I'd be interested for your perspective on whether these changes to the Green Port, the FGF, use the abbreviations easier to trip off the tongue, makes a difference to how scheme design might have happened if we started from today, or whether that has any influence on scheme design.
To be honest, I don't think it necessarily does have any impact. Say, the primary focus of the scheme is to protect existing development, essentially, and that's aligning with the action that came out of the flood risk management strategy. It's not preventing those sites to be developed in the future, and in fact, there's indications that those developments may proceed ahead of the scheme in any case. So I'm not sure that it would change. There's certainly been further a document that we referred to, which I just remember, but it was the SEPA document. I think it was to do with I was trying to find a specific reference, which I can find. Sorry, I think it was document FC 009-005, which I think was a document that was published after NPF4 came out, and it's SEPA giving their view on development behind protection schemes. And it's quite specific that, flood protection schemes can help to reduce risk, they can't eliminate it. Notes that their primary purpose is to protect existing development rather than to facilitate new development. And urges caution where consideration has been given to development that's protected by flood protection schemes. And again, any new development would have to be considered against various policies and legislation, and a point that we've made within I think both the council's written statement and their response is that the standard of protection behind this scheme wouldn't necessarily provide sufficient protection to new development, depending on the nature of that development, and whether it was considered water compatible use, I think is the phrase that's used in the vulnerability guidance for land planning. So yeah, I'm not sure that the kind of whole both being Freeport would fundamentally change the approach, because we are seeking to protect what exists at present, not necessarily what might be there in the future, which is largely, from our perspective, an unknown at the stage for developing the scheme.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah, so I've got a question for you after that, but yes.
Thank you. I want to just refer you to our 12th of January response to the council written statement, and in 2.8 we refer to the fact that despite its argument that you just heard, the primary purpose of this scheme is to protect existing development. The council go on to acknowledge in their own scheme purposes that it's a prerequisite to the significant future development proposals around the Grangemouth area, and that it can be an enabler to support future development where that use has been appropriately considered for its vulnerability to flood. So it seems to us all very well for the council to be referring to the SEPA guidance, but its own scheme objectives, the objectives of this scheme, quite clearly go beyond protecting existing development, which is why we say it is so important to consider the points we're making about developable land being excluded. And it's all the more strange if you just heard that it's not for the council to protect this land to enable future development. They are, of course, a partner in the fourth Green Freeport, that should be noted, but yet they maintain this position that you just heard, and they were perfectly capable of changing the scheme to reflect changed national policy with the fourth Green Freeport. That was quite long in the coming, and we see from the council's response to our written statement, and it's paragraph 5.7, that the land at the western edge of the port was first mentioned in Port's objection. That was in June 2024. The tax site status was effective in June 2024, the same month after the scheme was published. The design of the scheme was frozen in 2023 to allow preparation of the various scheme documents. It would have been open to the council to have said to itself, well, we've now got a fourth Green Freeport, policy is clearly changed, and we can certainly adjust the scheme to suit, but they decided not to do so. They froze the scheme because they wanted to get on with their scheme documents, and then they made their preliminary decision in January last year to confirm it, despite all of that. So they could have changed the scheme to reflect changing policy, but chose not to.
I'll come back to you for the question I want to ask. I'll just give the council to respond to that.
I think primary responses, unless I'm going to explain reasons why the council wouldn't necessarily change this decision, but notwithstanding designation of the both being Freeport already. So I don't think there's much more to add to that, but perhaps Mr. Dawson has a little bit more to add about the policy position.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Fort Ports have mentioned in terms of local development policy and some past discussions through that process. The energy park land was incorporated LDP2 within the extensive urban limit, but it's not currently in LDP2 designated as a business site the way the remainder of the report is. So the scheme alignment that we've come up with largely follows the same boundary as the development boundary. I think it should be recognised that yes, we are all part of the council. It is the council that are promoting the scheme. Indeed, some of us around the table today sit on some of the same bodies and organisations and groups that have been mentioned. But this is a distinct standalone project that we're trying to maintain progress with and trying to stick to a certain timeline with to move it forward and go through the various stages of the legislation that you must do. So we have at times been under pressure from Scottish Government that allows to meet specific deadlines, and it isn't always possible to flex and just wait indefinitely for other changing policies which may or may not be confirmed in a reasonable time frame. So I think that the process that we as a project team has taken forward is entirely justified. There are obviously in these areas around the port that have been mentioned in the port submission, there are a number of challenges similar to those that have been covered earlier this morning, around the environmental considerations, the geotechnical considerations, and the design principles about where possible maintaining floodplain and areas of functional floodplain. So there are a number of the same similar considerations that have been brought forward, and our position that we've explained to Fort Ports throughout that entire engagement has always been for the energy park land, and that we see that as undeveloped land, and as a project team don't see that as a requirement to be protected.
Yeah, I understand the different positions on that. What I wanted to pursue a little bit further is that if we go to the original objection that Fort Ports made and at paragraph 562, we propose that perhaps the scheme could be revised to include 2 routing options around the land from the energy park. Is that still, I think, a suggestion? Sort of allow future flexibility. It's on page 14 of your original objection.
What's a particular paragraph reference?
It's 5.6.2 on page 14. Under heading resolution required.
Well, I think that is one way of dealing with that, and I believe we follow that through in our written statement in relation to the parcel to the northwest that Mr. Knox referred to earlier. We didn't, I believe, do the same in our written statement in relation to the energy park land or indeed the Grange Burn land. I think we were just trying to illustrate that there are different ways in which one can try and provide for future permutations of development and what may or may not happen. That there is more than one answer to this, but to date, as you've heard, the council was just not willing to countenance. I mean, it's our view from the very beginning that there was never any wish to incorporate either the energy park land or the Grange Burn land within the scheme. And we were trying to, I think, respond to what was being said about the lack of certainty of future development by suggesting how that could be covered by a change to the scheme.
Thank you. So I suppose what I'm wanting to explore with the council, and we've sort of touched on it a bit already this morning is about the level of certainty and detail that's required at this point for scheme confirmation. So my reading of the original objection from Fourth Courts was they were strongly committed to having the energy park land and the Grangemouth land and the parcel in North West included within the protected area, if I can call it that. But they've recognised the concerns that the council have raised in terms of that land and has yet developed. So they're suggesting that perhaps there are two different options, basically, in terms of what I really wanted to explore was whether that's a political option or whether scheme design has to be a single set of options with a little bit of tweaking, as we've heard this morning, on just exactly how much flexibility there is.
I think one primary issue I think worth coming on where to cover habitat regulation matters later is I don't want to get into too much detail around it, but you will be aware from the documentation that the council is relying on derogation case under habitat regulations to ultimately to hopefully confirm the scheme. You know, one of the key aspects of that derogations case is that there have to be no alternative solutions. And there's a potential fundamental issue with having a confirmed scheme which has two potential options, particularly where those options may have very different impacts on the designated site. So I think from a legal perspective, there's a potential issue with that as a potential solution to the concerns. And Mr. McGowan, I'll let him answer that.
I think the only other point I would make is more specifically on the kind of legislation and regulations that I'm not aware of any case in any scheme where there's been alternative options. That's not to say it can't be done. I would have thought that would be frankly unusual because you would need to, there's various, depending on whether, as Mark mentioned, the HRA side, but there's also the EIA side that we would have to be assessing alternative options. And yeah, I've never seen that being undertaken, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can be undertaken. I just not my experience.
I know it wasn't the specific question you asked, but I know there was some reference to the LDP examination and some of the modifications made to the plan in relation to that. I just wanted to, for clarity, to point out, I think it was page 256 of the document by Fourth Courts, which referred to a modification recommended by the voter and ultimately made to the LDP, which was to amend the a line on the plan to include the energy park land and Grangemouth land identified by Fourth Courts. However, this was nothing to do with the alignment of flood defences. This was purely to identify where the water courses and coastline were. LDP did not offer a view on where the flood defences should go, nor would it be appropriate for the LDP to do so. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was clear, and as things stand, there is no land use designation or allocation for the energy park land anywhere really in the development plan.
Thank you. Yeah, just to pick up and expand on a few points. I think in terms of where we sit with current or future developments, and this doesn't just apply to Fourth Courts, but applies across the entire scheme area. I think there will be occasions when a development comes forward, which may in future require some sort of adjustment to the alignment that goes through this process. And I think it very much depends on when that proposed development comes forward. Some of those developments may come forward before we build the scheme, in which case they will go through a normal planning process. Their own flood risk will be assessed, and the solution to mitigate that flood risk will determine what defences are required, and the flood scheme would then flex to adapt and marry in with that development flood proposal. Alternatively, if the flood scheme comes first and the developer wishes to work, as Alan referred to it, on the wet side of that in the future, there's nothing precluding that. Defences could be removed, gates proposed or ramped over defences in certain locations, obviously depending on what was appropriate. And if that development was given the relevant planning status and granted permission to proceed. And just as an example of that, we've currently worked with another statutory authority who want to develop something on the west side of the defences before the defences are constructed. And they have been able to adjust the position of their development and that it doesn't clash with the future alignment of that we've proposed through the scheme documents. So I think there are instances when we acknowledge there could be adaptations that are required at future time, and each of those will need to be taken on their own merits and considered through the appropriate steps at that moment in time.
Wanting to come back.
Thank you. I appreciate you don't want the constant to and fro, but just a couple of points. In relation to your question about optionality, and you referred to 5.6 of our original objection, it strikes me that I'm not aware of any reason why this couldn't be done in terms of the 2009 Act governing this scheme. Optionality is normally not possible where there is compulsory purchase proposed, because you can't make out a compelling case for either parcel of land, therefore that rules it out. But here we're not talking about the compulsory purchase situation, so and I would have thought there should be a way through this in relation to habitat regulations assessment as well. So I certainly think in relation to both the parcels from the northwest that we were talking about, but also the Grangemouth land and the energy park land, this is something we would wish to continue to push forward, and in terms of the scheme being modified to have that optionality given the uncertainty of future development proposals. And the other point was really just I agree with what Mr. Murray said about the LDP2 business. We weren't saying that was anything other than a development plan policy, but it is important to sort of note the iteration of development plan policy, and we pointed out, and it's our appendix 3, that we're now participating in relation to the local development plan 3 and the call for sites. So we are certainly continuing to promote these sites for future development and wanting the local development plan to recognise that in the next iteration further than it does at the moment in terms of the sites being within the urban boundary.
Okay. Could I just pick up, we've mentioned the Grangemouth land and concern about access to that, and Paul, you're suggesting that a new access needs to be maintained through the flood protection wall, different to the two that have been shown. Is that correct? I understood you correctly there.
What we're saying, ma'am, is that the flood protection wall would need as rerouted in accordance with our proposals, would need a demountable section, so that access across the burn to the Grangemouth land, no doubt on a new crossing that would be required, could be maintained, because that's the only way across to the Grangemouth land. That is in the scenario of the flood protection wall being rerouted as we have requested around the energy park land. In relation to the current scenario, with the council's alignment for the flood protection wall, my understanding is that the access there proposing to include in the flood protection wall is at a different position. Mr. Knox can comment on that.
Yeah. I mean, the proposal at the moment is really kind of reflecting where there is access onto the site just now. You'll get better visibility and feel for that tomorrow on the site visit. It'll become abundantly clear, but in terms of how we would look at a solution to that problem, it really is what has just been covered there in terms of that realignment and the access next to the bridge that's available just now.
Anything you want to add from the council's point of view?
No, I think although that kind of clarification has been mentioned, it will be evident tomorrow that, yeah, the access that is being provided in the proposed flood defence aligns with where there's currently access on to that land. And yeah, I appreciate that if the alignment has changed, then you know, that access would need to also be moved. But yeah, where it is just now seems a logical location based on the proposed alignment with flood defences.
If it helps with record, it's scheme operations plan, cell 3, sheet 19.
And just then to pick up on the issue to do with the North Shore and the width. Again, I think there's a proposal from Four Ports that location of the flood protection wall to be moved further north. Is that correct? To maximise the capability of taking indivisible loads along there. Is that right?
That is correct. I don't know if Mr. Kerr wants to comment on that in more detail.
Yeah, I think the proposal would be to move it as far to the shore as possible. The alternative here is that it would stay in its current position and it would be made on a demountable basis. So there would be a restriction towards moving along that road on any section of the road beyond what's possible today.
Perhaps I'd like to respond again if they're out there. The design rationale for where it is located at the moment, and also whether or not there've been discussions. Perhaps been some discussions about.
Yeah, perhaps let Mr. Pico and cover this out. Actually, I think this point will quite helpful just to illustrate some of the council's position on engagement, and I'll let Mr. Pico get the detail on that.
Yeah, so the position of the kind of flood defence wall along North Shore Road, and it's as proposed just now, the proposed flood defence about 1 metre offset from the road, and this is I suppose largely due to the potential impacts of moving the flood defence further north. So I'm just waiting for an image.
Sorry, just trying to. Kathleen, you're in the right series of plans, but if you can go to sheet 4.
Oh, 4.
Yeah, so yeah, where it's currently positioned is about 1 metre offset from the edge of the road on the north side, and as I suppose as you can see from this plan, the space between what's indicated as the kind of shoreline where the blue hatching ends and the road, varies as you go along North Shore Road. It's not constant. I think in some places it drops down to 2 or 3 metres, the kind of space between the edge of the road, and in some places it's more than that. I think probably 10 metres, or it might even be in excess of that. But one of the kind of issues is we're looking at kind of coastal flooding here, as in we're interested in waves and the impact of waves, and we did kind of look at options of moving the wall kind of incrementally closer to the shoreline to understand what the impact would be, and the impact is quite significant when you consider the need for a rock revetment on the kind of wet side of the flood defences. The current alignment requires minimal rock revetment to be constructed, but even moving the wall 1 metre from its current position significantly changes that, and you require and moving 2 metres, it goes even further beyond that. And I appreciate Mr. Murray said earlier, we're kind of trying not to stray into kind of HRA territory just now, But the rock revetment, you know, it is, you know, it's not just going from like 100 meters to 150 meters. It was, from memory, you know, it was kind of going from 100 meters to, you know, 800, 900 meters of revetment would be required, which would require more work within the SPA itself. Just now, we have very limited work actually within the SPA, moving the ball further towards the estuary, and would significantly increase the impacts on the SPA and could potentially lead to a further adverse effect on site integrity through the loss of habitat. So the kind of HRA and also other environmental impacts, as well as some of the engineering challenges with, you know, the closer the flood defence becomes to the edge of the shoreline, you have to design that as a kind of retaining structure should any of that shoreline be eroded in the future. So, you know, these were the kind of primary considerations that were kind of driving us to the solution that is presented in the published scheme, is again trying to balance all those different aspects and come up with a solution. And we also did consider the existing constraints that appear to be there along North Shore roads that would have an impact already on the movement of these large loads, and trying to you know, when we looked at, you know, where we perceived the kind of pinch points to be, looking at whether the scheme made those any worse, and you know, we believed that it didn't make any, you know, it would make the situation any worse than some of the existing kind of high locations that would need to be kind of taken into account when moving roads.
Just to clarify in my mind, am I right in remembering that there's a suggestion that part of this, rather than being a fixed wall, could be made demountable to help provide greater clearance if necessary?
That was one of the suggestions that was made during the kind of, I suppose, following submission of the objection by both folks and the discussions that took place afterwards, that if there was any particular points where it was going to be a considerable constraint, that there could be the option of making parts of the wall demountable.
And what's the status of that? The wall, the drawings as shown, the scheme before me is solid wall rather than demountable. So is there, again, going back to sort of how much flexibility is there in terms of if the scheme is confirmed by the council, is that an element that you think would come within your wiggle room, or is that requiring further consenting processes?
Yeah, I think that's something that, you know, still be considered. I think obviously, and you know, and it was an issue raised by both folks. Obviously, if we have kind of demountable sections, they will have to be removed. And I think the preference would be to, you know, obviously not have any sections that needs to be removed, but it's certainly something that could still be considered.
Just to add to what Mr. McGowan said there, not all flood defence works need to be carried out under a flood protection scheme either. It's possible to carry out those works by agreement, so an agreement could be reached with both ports as to the nature of the amount of barriers, and if there was any doubt about the flexibility within the scheme, then those works could be carried out by under agreement with both ports, if that could be achieved.
Should come out, Mr. Owen.
Thank you. Just on this issue of demountable walls, it might help you if Mr. Kirk could just explain what is the typical sort of traffic of these large loads, because I think it's fair to say that looking at the council's response to our written statement, there's an assumption that they're all coming from or going onto the public highway, and much is made of that existing constraints. But my understanding, Mr. Kirk can confirm this, I'm sure, is that a lot of the movements are actually within the port itself.
the original statement, we did mention port traffic heading out on public road. But we do have examples most recently for NEOS for their work in their chemicals plant and their refinery, where the limiting size of these modules is what can come through the lock gates on a vessel. So we cannot restrict ourselves here to something that's the width of the road when the lock gate is 30 metres wide. That will be the size of the components that potentially are being moved within the north side of the port to future development sites within the port. And to contemplate having to then remove the flood protection wall to move that is not something that would be, let's just say, considered by the project as viable. The project just wouldn't happen. So welcome the demountable one. We did talk about that. We just never reached agreement over what demountable structure would be, which section or what length. But that would be a means by which a solution can be arrived at.
That's with your forbearance, I've just got one more question, and if we could deal with all the dock stuff before lunch, that would be appreciated. So I just wanted to pick up on the lock gate and the design of the lock gate, and I hear from the discussions that we got to a certain point, but there is now a desire, a wish from Forth Ports that you need more detail. Is that correct at this point? So I'm just keen to clarify exactly what the concern is about the lock gate, whether it's the detailed design, and then so I'll come to the council for a discussion.
Just with a brief introduction from me, I'll ask Mr. Heaps to cover that. But yes, there were some discussions about an agreement on lock gates design. Those that ground to a halt, I think in August 2024. But there have been a couple of discussions. Mr. Heaps can perhaps just summarise that, please.
Yeah, so we principally know gates, new focus areas, moving forward with technical design, with eventual collision or any impact on the gates that cause the hinge pins to shear. And also when construction takes place, how will that impact vessel operations, and how will vessel operations impact construction? And then also maintaining access for maintenance and repair. And then moving forward, really, there's always been a discussion to come on the operational gates, the ongoing maintenance and the liabilities.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. From the council's point of view, I just want to have an understanding. Again, it's harking back to a discussion we had earlier about the level of detail that you would expect to reasonably have at this stage, and what you can decide after the scheme is confirmed, if it is confirmed.
Yeah, I think as Mr. Heaps referred to kind of earlier, but that there has been, there was a lot of work put in prior to kind of August 2024, looking at different options for the lock gate, and I appreciate they only went so far, but they did go into a lot of detail, and that detail you don't see on the scheme documents and plans that were submitted. But I think we've always kind of maintained that position, that we fully appreciate the criticality of the lock gates to the whole port operation. And I don't think there's ever been any kind of suggestion that we believe that would be done in isolation from Forth Ports. We fully anticipate that Forth Ports would be involved during the design phase and looking at the construction, because some of this we have discussed in the past, will need to be done when the port is effectively shut to allow sufficient time to do some of the works in the lock channel. But we see kind of that level of detail coming next. It would be during the kind of detailed design phase, and then there's the whole kind of procurement that needs to be considered as well in terms of how this is procured, both the design and the construction. So yeah, I kind of fully agree that there needs to be close cooperation, and that I think I don't know if where it will come in, but discussion on agreements to kind of safeguard both, I suppose, Forth Ports' position and also the council's position on that. But yeah, there's a lot of work that still needs to happen in relation to the lock gates, and I don't think anyone's ever denied that, but it's just the time that that would happen would tend to be the kind of detailed design phase, which will be the next stage, hopefully, of the project. So, okay.
Just, I was just going to add to that, just to say that, the council's always been aware and acknowledged that there would need to be agreements with both ports on a lot of these matters, not least because of their status as a statutory undertaker, which I know we'll come on to later. Discussions had taken place, and his terms sort of proposed to at least start discussions around how that agreement would be structured, and looking at those discussions have sort of stopped at this point, but the council did welcome the comments in both ports statement that they recognise the agreement would be there, and an apparent willingness to progress an agreement with the council. The council shares that willingness, just to be clear.
Thank you. Mr. Heath, did you want to come back in?
Yeah, it was just a pertinent point, probably just around about the designer risk and the designer risk assessments that were captured within the long shortlist options. So there's probably maybe not been enough detail provided on how these were going to be overcome, probably similar to the Jarvie plant discussion, where it's okay to say it's going to happen in the future, but probably some high level there, around about the shearing and the shear pin options for either increased floodwater or vessel collision that would lead to significant port outage, and then how we would be resilient in the event of.
Thank you.
And ma'am, if I could just come back on very much welcome what we've heard about the council's willingness and wish to work with Forth Ports on the design of the lock gates. It's not, though, however, just a matter between the council and Forth Ports. It is a matter for you in terms of whether this scheme as presented is acceptable from an overall public point of view, and this is why it takes us back to what I was saying earlier about the complete lack of any planning conditions, because this is exactly the kind of matter you'd expect to see a planning condition on, setting out what the council is proposing by way of detailed conditions governing the design process for the lock gates, given the public importance of the port of Grangemouth to the national economy. That's exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to see. And for your reference, I failed to give it earlier, it is section 57 of the Town and Country Planning Scotland Act of 1997, and 57 subsection 2 deals with this issue, that on a local authority confirming a flood protection scheme, the Scottish ministers must direct that planning permission for that development shall be deemed to be granted, subject to such conditions, if any, as may be specified in the direction. So it's of real public importance as well as interest to Forth Ports, given our position as a statutory undertaker. What are these controls through planning conditions proposed to be? We don't know, and this is a good example of an issue of critical mitigation, if you like, critical control on detailed scheme design and implementation, where we need to see what the proposed conditions are to be.
Thank you. I think it would be helpful to explore that further, but I'm also conscious that it's 1:10. So I am open to views of whether the council would like to do a planning commission issue now, or whether you would like to deal with that first thing after lunch.
Yeah, no, we're happy to deal with that
After lunch, okay. Well, in which case I think we'll adjourn for lunch here. 1:10 now. Apologies for running over slightly, but it's important to keep the flow going, I feel. If we could all convene again, say in about an hour, so perhaps somewhere between 5 past, 2, that'd be appreciated.